Today's lesson starts a new time, a new era, where Leah wrongfully credits something wrong for the fact that she got a fifth son is corrected today. But she still has disillusions about what would attract her husband. Let's read it and unpack it and find out. And Leah conceived again, verse 19, and we finish in verse 24. And Leah conceived again and bore Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God has endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him six sons. And she called his name Zebulon. And afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. We have here two different stories. The last two children that Leah would have, and the first child that Rachel would have. So let's unpack this and examine this. Apparently the mandrakes did not work at all for Rachel, did they? So for Leah to conceive again and bearing Jacob the sixth from her, Jacob must have spent more time with her than before. In response to giving birth to her son, she said, God has endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him six sons. God had abundantly made it up to her, she said. Although her husband gave her nothing at marriage, it was more than made up for in how many children she now had. Oh, she said, this would fix his affections towards her and cause him to cleave to her like a husband should to a wife, and continue with her and to live with her and to dwell with her. She was so in love with her husband, she wanted him all the time. Alas, it wouldn't happen. He was still so much in love with Rachel. But you see, Leah thought that her bearing Jacob all these sons would cause him to love her even more and finally move in to stay with her. So consequently, she called her last son's name Zebulon, and that meant dwelling or habitation or living. This may have worked for a while, because afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah, meaning judgment, or the one who judges. This is the only daughter that is named of Jacob. This is the only daughter that is identified, Dinah. Probably because of what happened in chapter 34, that's why she's the only one identified. And we're going to get to chapter 34, and it is a very, very sad tale. But we do know he had other daughters. We read in Genesis 37, 34 to 35, where Jacob was mourning for one of his sons. We'll get there. And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And here it is. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. We also know he had sons and daughters from Genesis 46, verse 7, where Jacob moved to Egypt during another famine. His sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into Egypt. I don't know why they aren't all mentioned, but they are. So he had sons and daughters through his two wives. And Zilpah and Bilhah. So, not from Rachel. Rachel only got him 2 children. We'll get there too. So in all, Leah bore Jacob 7 children. I wonder, could there be any significance to that, considering what 7 stands for? So now we move on to verse 22. Verse 22 talks about God remembering Rachel. It starts off with a simple yet beautiful: God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her. Hearken is an old King James expression that says he really listened hard. Now, in his mercy and kindness, God responded to her prayers, which had been made time and again, that she might have children. And finally, he opened her womb. And all she could say was, God hath taken away my reproach. And yes, she was barren because God had closed her womb. It appears that she eventually gave up taking matters in her own divisive plans and sought God by prayer. And God heard her. Her faith, her prayer and faith obtained what her impatience and unbelief could not. God was the source of life. She bore a son and called his name Joseph, meaning increase or addition. I would like to close today's study with a brief examination of God's favor to Rachel in this reading. First, God's favor to Rachel was long delayed. The blessing which Rachel had long desired was eventually granted. You see, God grants his favor as it pleases him and him only, and yet always with a view to discipline us. For over 14 years of her married life, Rachel was barren. But God remembered Rachel as if she had been forgotten from our own human point of view. Especially as it seemed that prayers were of no use. They didn't go beyond the ceiling when they're not answered right away. Folks, God always gives us three answers. Yes, no, wait a while. Now her prayer and faith obtained what her impatience and unbelief could not. And that is what I just read. Okay? But if we are faithful, which Rachel did become, we shall be blessed according to the time which God determines. God isn't late. God isn't early. God times it just right according to his plans. God's favor to Rachel was granted to her after important lessons were learned by her. Rachel had to learn the lesson of dependence. She was so proud, she tried to take things, she tried to maintain control on her own. Didn't she? Whatever human means are used to gain what we want, all ultimate sources depend upon the will of God. All gifts come from God's hands. Rachel had to learn the lesson of patience. She had to wait long for his blessing, and when it was granted, she would see how good it was to be patient. When we read about Joseph, we will see it was worth it all. Rachel had to learn the lesson of faith and hope. She had now learned not to despair when God did not at once grant her her desires. It was good to believe and hope in a trustworthy God. Finally, God's favor to Rachel awakened gratitude. She recognized God hath taken away my reproach. She did not trace the gift to some irresponsible powers of nature like those mandrakes, but to the distinct favor of a personal God. She called the name of her son Joseph, saying, "The Lord shall add to me another son." She had previously, in verse 6, believed in a vague, invisible, eternal God. But now she recognized not God, but the Lord. You see, this was an important advance in her spiritual knowledge, in her feeling, and in her maturing. To her now, the distant God became a near God. The God of nature becomes the God of providence, answering your personal prayer and grace. Folks, we look at this. Do you realize that God follows a similar pattern with all of us? You know, it seems like a cliche, but all I can say is, keep the faith, baby.